today to talk about the importance of pressure gauges on your canopy sprayer. So your pump is basically thought of as like the heart of your sprayer. It's pushing fluid through the rest of the system. The pressure gauge would then be analogous to a blood pressure cuff, where it's the only device you have to see if the pump is working correctly. So, and it's quick and easy and can be done on the fly while you are actually spraying. So it is really critical that that piece of equipment is working correctly. The other reason it's important is that when we set our pressure as to whatever we think we might want it to be, 100 PSI, 200 PSI, etc., if it isn't correct, then we know from looking at any T-Jet nozzle catalog that if you look across the top and you see what pressure you're spraying at, then you can see how the gallons per minute on each nozzle would increase or decrease depending on what the pressure is. So if you think you are spraying at a specific PSI and you are spraying higher than that PSI or lower than that PSI, then you are essentially putting on the wrong rate on your canopies. There's one or two important things about a pressure gauge. You can see that different pressure gauges have different ranges. So on this pressure gauge, it maxes out at 60, and on this one, it maxes out at 200. To be the most accurate, you want your needle for whatever your desired PSI to be in the middle of the range of the pressure gauge. So this pressure gauge would be more applicable to a weed sprayer where you're gonna spray somewhere between 20 and 40 PSI because the needle would be in the middle of the range of the pressure gauge. Alternatively, this pressure gauge is more relevant to a canopy sprayer where you might be going at about 100 PSI. So the next important thing is to look at whether they're fluid filled or dry filled. So you might be able to see the fluid in here with the bubble moving around. And this one is simply filled with air. So the one that is filled with glycerin is easier to read because the needle bounces up and down a little bit less. So if you are on a tractor, turning back and looking at a pressure gauge, then you'd be able to see the needle as it's a little bit more steady. So while this one is just a couple bucks more expensive, it actually allows for higher accuracy of the reader. Now you go out to your sprayer and you want to know if your pressure gauge is good or bad. There are some easy ways to see this right off the bat. So if you go to your sprayer and you see that the needle does not return to 0, then you know it's bad. So this one's an extreme. It goes to 40. Sometimes they're just stuck at 5. You cannot simply add 5 to the pressure, and it is not a linear relationship. So if the needle does not return to 0, it's time to replace it. Another thing is if you can't actually see through it and read the pressure gauge, because the whole point is to be able for the driver to be able to see it. But it's usually also indicative of the pressure gauge being bad completely. So another one is on this sprayer, or on this pressure gauge. It used to be fluid filled, and you can see that the fluid is about halfway up. So it's now halfway down. So if it used to be fluid filled and now it's dry, it no longer is effective. So, and lastly, another one that we see where it looks pretty good from the beginning, where it looks fluid filled, it looks clean, but if you look closely at the needle, this pressure gauge has overheated and the needle is blown all the way around to the other side, where when you start the sprayer, that the needle will not actually go up and around because it's blown all the way clockwise to the end of the tab. So now you have an easy decision to do if the pressure gauge is visually bad. Just replace it. But then you have this range of pressure gauges that appear to be fine. So what do? Well, the manufacturers of pressure gauges generally consider them reliable for a year. So you can annually just make a decision to replace the pressure gauge. It's a relatively inexpensive, $20-ish option to replace. Or you can build a device like this, where you would add an air compressor down here with an air compressor hose. You have a one gauge here that's acting as your test gauge or your reference gauge. You would take your gauge off of your sprayer and you'd add it and screw it into here. When you fill it up with pressure, the two should match. right? So you can do it this way, but you have to make sure that you have the same PSIs. So this one was 40 and this one was 200. So you have to have the same type of gauge with the same range and make sure that they actually match and make sure that the needles match. Or do a simple management decision that says for the amount of extra chemical I could be spraying if I get this gauge incorrect, that it's easier to include this just in my general annual maintenance plan. So the pressure gauge is extremely important to be able to understand if the calibration that you did before calculating how much gallons per minute per nozzle that you're getting out, if it's actually accurate to putting it out of the sprayer. To learn more, feel free to contact the WSU Extension Office, or there's a wealth of information on sprayers101.com.